Hello everybody, welcome to this current video that we're going to be talking about values, right? So this will also be uploaded into our podcast and it will be expanded beyond what I'm going to share now, simply because I actually have people who share about their values, right? So I'm going to just announce that a little bit later on, but meanwhile, let's take a look at what values are. So at Chrysalis, we are really passionate about values because we find that values is really just one of the ways in which that we can practice and get really clear about it, and that it will help us with many other areas in our lives, right? So recently, in this past month or so, I actually have been conducting workshops on self-care. And in self-care, really the discovery is also that if we are clear about our values, we actually are able to self-care better. Right. So as part of the workshop that I conduct, the participants actually go through what I call the ABCs of self-care. And in the ABC of self-care, A stands for awareness. As part of the awareness piece, I really go through the values with them and get them to really understand what does these values mean to them, because it is important for them to be able to define it, as well as then experiment and experience these values in their day-to-day lives. We only talk about values in a way that means something to the participants, not in a way that is a definition by the dictionary, right? So this podcast series really focuses a lot on values because it is so important, and the reason why it's ABC of self-care, or ABC of anything in fact, is really because with the awareness that we have, and in this case awareness of our values, then we are able to perhaps then draw and set certain boundaries for ourselves. If we are not clear and aware of perhaps what these values mean to us and how important it is and how it's been defined and being experienced, then it's a little bit difficult to define certain boundaries that we might want to have to take care of ourselves as well as to take care of others around us, right? So that's the ABCs. Well, the C part is really compassion, which is a value in its own, right? So we just going through this process, and the entire idea of this podcast series or this video series is really to bring this to light and to allow more people to experience the values and become a bit clearer. I think what COVID has done for us during this year is really to highlight that if we are not clear of what we stand for, then we perhaps stand for nothing, right? And values gave us that gauge or that compass for us to navigate this world with a bit more clarity and allowing us to understand and develop ourselves further as human beings. So let's talk about values, and let's be able to say what are values and what do they really mean. So why do we talk about values in the first place? I think I shared quite a little bit of that already, and really one of the important aspects of values is really how it enhances self-awareness. So the way that I define self-awareness is what you can see above the iceberg, what the areas that you can see of the iceberg above the waterline, and then what you can't potentially see below the waterline, right? So it's pretty much adopting the iceberg theory to explain a little bit more about self-awareness. So what you can see above the waterline are typically aspects of our actions and our behaviors and our bodily sensations, right? Even bodily sensations, for some of us, we might need to take some practice. Actions and behaviors are quite straightforward. We're kind of taught in school to behave in a certain way or to act in a certain way. And when we are given feedback by our peers, our teachers, our parents, our mentors, and so on and so forth, it's usually based on our actions and our behaviors. This is how you behave, this is how you acted, and how it impacted other people, how it influenced other people, and then, how do you fine-tune that to further enhance the process. So that was based on really actions and behaviors. Bodily sensations, it depends on our own personal sensitivities. So typically, we will only notice our bodily sensations when it hurts or when we are in pain, because that's how the sensations are sent to our brain to take care of us, right? If it is something that we don't typically notice is things that we have taken for granted. For example, at this point in time, I have a fan blowing behind me, and I feel the sensation of the wind from the fan on the surface of my skin. And I typically wouldn't take note of that until I make myself aware of it. So I need to then practice becoming aware of my bodily sensations. Right. And the way that for me, I approached that was really through mindfulness. There are many of us who could experience it differently. Some of us experience it through exercise. Some of us experience it through perhaps like yoga, right? There are many other ways that you can experience bodily sensations. It's how you choose to practice it. So that is something that I would also consider as above the line, because it can be quite direct and quite immediate to notice. What are below the waterline in terms of the iceberg theory is things like thoughts and emotions. Most people can't read other people's minds, so I can't see the exact thought that's happening in your head right now as you're listening to this or as you're watching this, simply because I really don't know. I can't see the wavelengths in your brain. I can assume that perhaps you're learning something. I can assume that perhaps you are gaining some benefit from this video or this podcast. I can make assumptions about what I say and how it impacts you, and that becomes the actions or the behaviors as well. But what I can't see is your thought processes, and what you can't see are my thought processes, right? Similarly with emotions, unless we display other emotions on our face or in our body language, otherwise we actually have no clue what emotions the person might be experiencing. So an example that I'm going to give you is last year, sometime in September, I was admitted to the hospital for acute appendicitis. While I was waiting in the A&E, the accident and emergency ward, the doctors came to see me, and they were explaining to me about my condition, and they were also explaining to me if I was to go into surgery or go into a procedure, what would be the risks involved. So all the while that I was there for about, I think, a good 18 hours to 24 hours or so, I was relatively calm. Again, at this point in time, I'd just like to acknowledge that I credit this calmness to my profession of being a facilitator as well as being a mindfulness teacher. I think the practice of mindfulness really allowed me to be really in a calm space for most of the time that I was there. And actually, I was carrying a lot of curiosity with me as I was observing the nurses working within the space, as well as the other patients within the space, what they were experiencing and what they were going through. And every time the doctors and the nurses come and speak to me, I was in a relatively calm state, trying to understand what they were sharing and what was the intention behind the sharing, and how serious my condition might be and what kind of decisions I have to make. So my expression on my face was pretty much calm, until the point in time when the doctor or the houseman had to come and explain to me the risk that was involved. By that time, I was actually a bit overwhelmed with some of the information, and I was in my head trying to make certain decisions. And the houseman was telling me about the risk. So one of the risks that was involved was about the general anesthesia that I will put into, which is GA, and there is a certain risk of perhaps not waking up. Right. So at that point in time, when he mentioned that there might be a point in time that I might not wake up, and that there is a certain risk, although the risk is really, really low. I think it was a 1% or something like that. It actually caught my attention, I suppose, and then I teared. And the response from the houseman was, "Are you crying?" And I was like, yeah, at some point in time, I would have some anxiety, I assume, and I would, have to demonstrate that emotion of anxiety. And he's like, "Oh, because you were so calm throughout and you were quite, collected, we actually didn't know what you were experiencing, and that you might have been going through anxiety." And I'm like, sure, right? So again, if the emotions was not displayed on the face or in the body language in any way, someone else will not be able to notice what my emotion might be. And which is why I'm placing thoughts and emotions under the surface, just under the surface, because at some point these might surface. Again, how aware we are to notice how this surfaces. Right. The other things that are below the surface could be things like motivation, what motivates us, and usually these are either demonstrated through actions and behaviors, or it needs to be articulated. So if it's not been articulated yet or has not been demonstrated, we actually have no clue what might be motivating the individual. And the individuals themselves, without that clarity or without understanding their thoughts and emotions and checking the patterns in their behaviors and actions, they might not be as aware of what those motivations might be either. And motivations can be also part of values and beliefs and conditioning, because we hold certain values, because we hold certain beliefs, and because of certain conditioning we might have in our lives. Therefore, our motivations could be structured in that way. So an example is, if I value my family, then my motivation would be whatever that I do, I will do with my family in mind. So for example, if I was to go and earn money, and I need to find a profession to do that, I would find a profession that would then provide me perhaps time with my family, or would provide me with sufficient money for me to take care of my family, right? And then I will be motivated to do the job. No matter how crappy it is, I will come back to saying that because family is the key area in which I'm valuing, and therefore I will be motivated to do the work to support my family, right? That's one example, right? So the beliefs that I have could also be powering my motivations, right? So if I believe that the only way to go is to understand our values, so do you see that's the motivation for me to do this video? For me to then share my perspective of what the importance of values are with the world. So that was the reason, belief that I have that values is one of the ways in which we can better ourselves and raise that awareness for ourselves, and then in the process perhaps self-care for ourselves better, right? There are many reasons why values are important for me, and I in my own practice and in my own development and experience and journey, I have discovered that, hey, actually values play a really big part, and I really need to harness and experience these values for me to be able to do a better job with the work that I'm doing, right? And then conditioning as well. I think conditioning, I don't have to elaborate too much on it. The most straightforward one is, why do we go for certain professions and motivated to study harder to do certain things? It's usually through societal conditioning to say that certain professions are better than other professions, or that I am going to earn more money, or I'm going to be recognized more, and therefore I am motivated to achieve that, right? So that's some of the reasons why values are important, to know where we stand, and really because values is a part of self-awareness. And I mean, we can touch on all the rest as well, and we have done so in previous videos as well as the workshops that we conduct. So if these other areas are places that you are keen to explore and discover more about yourselves, please do contact us so that we are able to then support you in having that enhanced self-awareness for yourself. But today's video or podcast is really to introduce why it is important to know our values, or to be clear about our values. So what are values? These are not defined by me. These are actually defined by various websites. Values are basic and fundamental beliefs that guide or motivate attitudes or actions. Personal values are personal beliefs about the right and the wrong, and the may or may not be considered moral, right? So this is defined by this website called ethicssage.com, and they wrote this in 2018. And I kind of resonate a little bit with this definition, right? Because I do believe that values are basic and fundamental beliefs that guide or motivate attitudes or actions, right? So I kind of like resonate with that piece. And then the other definition that we have here is that your values are the things that you believe are important in the way you live and work. And this is on the website called mindtools.com. And really, I resonate a lot more with this because that's the way that I was also taught in a way on what values are, and it's really how we place the virtues that we experience in our day-to-day on the priority list of what might be important and what will guide us in the way that we live and we work, right? So having that, that's also the reason why it was important for me to really get some clarity around what is valuable to me, or what are my values, right? Because with that clarity, then I start to see a lot more patterns in my life, a lot more ways that I approach the way that I live and the way that I work, the way that I interact with people, the way I interact with myself, right? So like, money isn't something that I absolutely value. I see it as a vehicle, I see it as a tool to get the things that I value. So for example, I value time a lot more, and therefore I see money as a way of supporting my value of time as a resource, right? So I value relationships a lot more, and I see money as a resource to support my relationships, which is why then money becomes important to me. But I have a clarity around this in a way that I will not compromise relationships for the sake of money, right? I will not compromise the quality of my time for the sake of money. So those are the things that I get clearer about the moment I am able to identify what is important to me, which is why we are having this conversation today, to really just unpack this concept of values. So the reason I took a lot of time to come up with like these core values for the company, for Chrysalis, because I needed time to kind of like practice these values and get a sense and clarity around these values before I can say that yes, these are the ones that I, as a company, as a business, we are going to uphold, and we're going to practice a lot more, right? So like, for example, the way that I define compassion might be different from how other people might define compassion. So the way I define compassion is that we are wholehearted about accepting and honoring ourselves and others. So in my dictionary for compassion, it's not just for other people, it's also for ourselves. And it's about that wholehearted acceptance and honor for ourselves and others, means that judgment is removed, right? Or judgment is at least suspended, right? And if I hold any judgment of anyone or of myself, I actually am able to acknowledge that this is a judgment. And therefore, because it's a judgment, it might not hold as much weight in a certain conversation, because that conversation was meant to be neutral, right? So another value that as Chrysalis we hold is the value of hope. And perhaps people will describe hope as the light at the end of the tunnel, and so on and so forth. The way that we describe hope is that we are mindful about making a difference and creating a positive impact. So the way that hope looks like for me is actually through mindfulness. And it's about, holding that space to make a difference. And when I talk about difference, what kind of difference am I trying to make? It is about that positive impact. So that is how I see hope as, and that's how I run the business based on, when I decide which jobs to take on. It is also about, what kind of impact that I'm going to create. Am I going to create hope, or am I going to create hopelessness? Right. So that's for me to take note of. The other aspect of our core values in Chrysalis is courage. And the way that I describe courage is really to actually have to talk about our fears. So what I say about courage is we continually seek to grow by breaking through our fears and persevering until we get there. Right? Where is there? I have no clue. But I do know that, for me to demonstrate courage, I need to seek for that growth and to break through whatever fears that might come my way, and to continue to persevere until I get there. Right? So that's how I experience these three through the practice of these three values, and that's how I am able to be clearer about this, and how this will then guide my actions, behaviors, and the way forward in terms of how I run the business and how I lead my life. So that's kind of like an overview of what values are, what you will hear subsequently in the podcast will not be my definitions, but really the definitions of some students that I have worked with. So we do have an arrangement with Ngee Ann Polytechnic in the work that they do with their film and media studies students, specifically for the film, sound and video students in that diploma. And they have a particular module in their year 2 course of study that is called sound design. And as part of the course of that study, they learn about how to maximize the sound and how to make the sound clear, whether it is voice, whether it is, sound effects, whether it's music. They learn that, and as part of their learning, they will then use that skill and that knowledge to provide a service for someone else. And I'm very honored and blessed to be chosen to be the partner with them in this particular module in their service, in providing the service for, and therefore I also hope that they will discover a little bit more and raise their self-awareness in terms of the values that they practice, right? So what has happened is actually we have been working with them for about 3 to 4 years now, and we have actually quite a number of values that the students have practiced across the different batches of diploma in the FSV diploma, and they have then recorded themselves in the practice of the values that they have chosen. So we gave them a list to choose from, and then they had to go and practice those values and then record it into like a audio bite for them to be able to share how that experience has been like for them and what is their definition of that particular value they have chosen. So in the subsequent podcast, and you will only hear this in the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and whichever other channels that you can find podcasts on, you will only hear their definitions on that. You won't see it in the video. So if you are keen to allow yourself to learn more about values, and you like to hear from these students about their experience in practicing these values and how they define certain values, then I encourage you to go onto Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whichever podcast platform that you're listening from and look for Chrysalising, which is the name of our podcast series, and look specifically for the list that I'm going to roll out with regards to values. So these values will then be attached to whatever values that the students have chosen. So for example, the value of love, the value of empathy, the value of honesty, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, some of the values will have probably more than one student who have selected to experience and experiment with. So you hear more than one student sharing their experience and their definitions of what that particular value is. And then there might be some values that only one student might have chosen, and you will hear only that one student sharing, right? And this entire podcast series will continue to evolve as long as we continue to work with these students, right? So currently at this point in time, there's actually one group of students that is going through the diploma now, and they are putting together their experience and putting it into an audio bite. I would likely receive this batch's audio bites perhaps sometime early next year. So you won't hear from the current batch, but you will be hearing from the previous batches. So enjoy the podcast. It's not meant to be heavy. It's meant to be kept light and really to just allow it to be a platform for you to listen. And I think my suggestion and my hope for you, and you see hope comes up again, my suggestion and my hope for you, whoever that might be listening to this podcast series, is if you already have a definition for yourself for the values that you honor, then go ahead and experiment with that first. After you've done experimenting with that, and when I say experiment with that, I think it's like if you hold the value of honesty or integrity in this following week since you're hearing this announcement, is to really go and be more aware of when you are practicing honesty, when are you practicing integrity, for example, and then formulate kind of like a definition for yourself, like honesty means this to me, or honesty looks like this to me. I see this is how I demonstrated honesty, or this is how I spoke about honesty, right? So that's one way to practice. And I'm just going to give you a quick example of coming out with a definition, right? So the typical definition of empathy is that to put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? So I'm going to repeat that again. The common definition of empathy is to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And as I'm practicing the value of empathy, I realized that if I was to literally do that, to place myself in someone else's shoes, and if I'm wearing a pair of shoes, I will find that either it's a very tight fit or it'll be very uncomfortable because I have not removed my own shoes, right? So I won't be able to fit into other people's shoes as well. So in that process of practicing empathy, what I learned is for me to really experience what it is like to be in other people's shoes, I need to first remove my own shoes, which is a definition that we have never been taught. But it evolved from my own experience to be able to remove my own shoes. And that seems to be said in a very literal form. So if I was to translate this into a more relevant form, when I say remove my own shoes, it's literally removing my own judgments, my own biases, my own life experiences, for me to be able to place myself in someone's experience, someone's lens or perspective. As long as I'm wearing my own shoes or I'm wearing my own judgments and perspectives, it will be very difficult for me to actually demonstrate empathy. So that's how that definition of empathy kind of evolved for me. So I'm going to invite you to then try for those values that you hold for yourself. Right, so thank you very much for listening to me at this juncture. And if you are watching this video, my suggestion and encouragement is really to go onto our podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and whichever platform that you are, and look for Chrysalising. We have several different series there because we have been on the podcast for coming to about a year, and so we have curated quite a lot of conversations with ourselves and also with other people. So if you're keen to just explore all those others as well, please go ahead. If you're just specifically here to look for this values-based kind of podcast, then go ahead and do that as well. So we will be rolling this out over a course of perhaps the rest of this month, because it's quite a lot of audio bites, and we don't want to flood ourselves or flood the Spotify or Apple podcast stuff, and have you actually be able to do it slowly as well, right? Because it's really about a practice. So values isn't something that's spoken about. Values is something that we practice and we do and we demonstrate. So start thinking about that until we start loading up all those. And thank you very much for, thanks in advance for being such a sporting audience to join us on this journey. And what we would also really appreciate is, if possible, for you to share it with your friends, especially if it has been meaningful for you, and for you to be able to benefit from this entire program. If it has benefited you, do share with us in the comments. If it hasn't benefited you, we also welcome that feedback, because then it only helps us to get better and helps us to then fine-tune what we might need to do to support you better. Right? So with that, thank you once again. Have a great day ahead. Whenever you are listening to this, it could be at night even. And if if it is at night, then have a good rest. Right? We'll see you soon in our future programs that will be coming up. All right. Thank you very much.